Prof.
Okay. So good morning, everybody, and thank you,
Good morning.
Abosede
Good morning, Prof.
and all my colleagues for this venue. This is indeed historic. I'm very pleased that Abosede Pediola has also already pointed out the historic and that we are aware of the historic importance of this occasion today. So I will give my brief remarks on feminism and African philosophy. Starting with Karl Marx, I'd like to share this, that the philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. This gives me an entry point into philosophy as not just the realm of thought, but also a realm of action. Our philosophies inform the world and inform the world the way it is and the sense we make of it and the plans we make to change it and develop it. So for me, philosophy is a thing not just of theory, but also of action and of praxis. What is philosophy? What is African philosophy? And where are women in African philosophy? What do African women bring to philosophy? Our opening address has already given us some key pointers in this direction, and particularly on the relationship between African women and philosophy. However, African philosophy is a complex question. Some claim that seeking to explore African philosophy was a futile attempt more suited to the realm of cultural anthropology. Others have held that African philosophy was merely a new thing that began in recent times under the auspices of Western philosophy, while yet others argued that African philosophy has been present for as long as people have contended with their existential situation in the world. And if I have any leanings, it's towards the last of those positions. I would argue that humans, for as long as they have been human, have had the ability to reflect on the world. And as humanity began in Africa, we can assume that philosophy and civilization also began in Africa. Even if we just look at Europe, even the early European philosophers, there was an African philosopher in Germany back in the 1700s. He was the first African to study at a Christian university and became the first philosopher in Europe since Roman times. He came from Axim and he may well have been a slave, but he was adopted and trained and did a PhD in philosophy and participated in the German debates of his time. And interestingly, this was at a time when very few people believed that Africans could have any philosophy at all. Philosophy literally translates Philosophy literally translates into love of wisdom, a capacious definition that is far more inclusive than the narrow definitions of the academic field. According to the much narrower definition offered by the encyclopedias, philosophy refers to the rational, abstract, and methodical consideration of reality as a whole, or of fundamental dimensions of human existence and experience. Now, this definition emerged from the Age of Enlightenment, during which, as Abosede Padiola already pointed out, during that era, Western scientific reason began to replace religion and theology in the minds of many. The focus was therefore on scientific rationality and logic, both of which contrasted to faith, belief, and idealism. However, we can also observe that philosophical inquiry is not limited to the Western methodologies, and that these are premised on very particular definitions and assumptions about what is rational and what reason actually is. African philosophers have different views on this. To explore world philosophy at a general level, one can usefully start with Julian Baggini, whose book, How the World Thinks, A Global History of Philosophy, addresses the major philosophies of the world that we inhabit. As an antidote to the Eurocentrism of received philosophy, his overview addresses the major philosophical traditions originating in various regions of the world, From the East, he identifies several varieties of Buddhism, Confucianism, Hinduism, and Islamic philosophies, distinguishing these from European philosophy in a number of ways. However, his treatment of African philosophy is at best cursory, and he does not elaborate on the contributions of feminism to the philosophical traditions of the world. In this respect, he is not alone, as mainstream philosophers, as we have heard, have seldom engaged with the existential and philosophical questions that arise from the fact that inequalities arising from sex and gender pervade all known societies. He does not assume the supremacy of Western philosophy, but rather situates this on the same plateau alongside the philosophies of Asia and African philosophies. However, as Africans, we know better than most that in the colonial past, the West committed epistemicide by disparaging and dismissing the intellectual lives of others as barbaric or primitive, and making such recuperation of the world's philosophies a necessary task. Happily, the end of the 500-year age of empire and colonial rule itself has undermined the West's self-assumed and violently asserted global supremacy. However, philosophy remains a predominantly male preserve. African philosophy is now a large field of scholarship. And long before the emergence of modern feminism, the fact is that African philosophers were challenging the colonial heritage and its implications for us. The task of challenging male supremacy, however, has been left to feminist philosophers, both in the West and elsewhere in the world. I'll now say a few words about epistemicide, imperialism, and African philosophy. In the case of Africa, the history of imperialism and the accompanying violence perpetrated against non-European peoples has been profound. As we all know, in the realm of ideas, colonialism wrought havoc with indigenous knowledge systems, creating conditions that saw Western philosophers opining that African peoples were incapable of philosophical thinking. For them, the African mind was seen as lacking the capacity to engage in abstract thought or higher reasoning of any kind, as the former speaker pointed out. One of the first Westerners to argue that African people did in fact have philosophy was the Belgian Reverend Father working in the area that is now known as the DRC. While we may find much to quarrel with the explicitly colonial motives behind his 1945 book, Bantu Philosophy, and the ensuing outpouring of ethnophilosophy, the fact remains that the Reverend Father differed from his contemporaries, those that Abosede Padiola mentioned, his contemporaries, because he posited the idea that Black Africans had any philosophy at all, at a time when most Westerners dismissed the argument as they were busy disparaging all the indigenous thought systems they encountered. Since that time, some have claimed that seeking to explore African philosophy was a futile attempt, more suited to the realm of cultural anthropology. Whichever position one takes, it is clear that Africans are as capable of engaging in philosophical reflection as anyone else, as the example of Anton Wilhelm Amo shows us. Western studies of psychology attempted to provide scientific evidence that supported these Western prejudices against African intellect. For example, the British psychiatrist J.C. Carruthers regarded what he referred to as the African mind as inferior, so that as recently as 1972, his monograph, The African Mind, is a catalogue of mental deficiencies, and his work on the psychology of Mau Mau pathologizes the anti-colonial resistance offered by the Land and Freedom Army of Kenya. Frantz Fanon, the Martinican psychiatrist, observed that Western theories about Africans were imbued with racist assumptions that ignored the political realities and conditions of colonialism, so it was a depoliticizing discourse. In one of his essays, Fanon angrily exposes how a French psychoanalyst by the name of Octave Manoni formulated a psychologically deterministic theory of colonization. In this, he argued that colonization was not political, but the result of an inherent dependency complex among the natives. And in doing this, he was ignoring the historical and military facts of conquest and colonization. According to Manoni, the Malagasy people had a dependency complex that predisposed them to embrace the colonialists as if they were their own ancestors and therefore accept domination. What Fanon points out was that by the time Manoni visited Madagascar, the local people had already been subject to such violent pacification that this was more likely to account for their apparent acquiescence that Manoni observed. The history of colonialism and its ongoing legacies in the contemporary era have burdened African philosophers with a great deal of recuperative and restorative work with regard to indigenous philosophical traditions. Such work is ongoing in the face of global conditions that have remained unfavorable towards philosophies from the South. Few would now deny the existence of Eastern philosophies, but the same cannot quite be said of African philosophy in certain circles. The reality is that we have to ask ourselves how many African universities actually can boast a thriving department of philosophy. And where such departments exist, have they gone beyond teaching the Western canon to center African philosophers? Our universities, on the whole, have yet to become the great knowledge centers of the African world that men like Kwame Nkrumah once envisaged. Take the example of Cheikh Anta Diop, the multidisciplinary Senegalese scholar, scientist, and philosopher who wrote The African Origins of Civilization in the 1950s. He was never allowed to teach at the university that was named after him only once he was safely dead. In the West, African American researchers who have argued against white supremacy and demonstrated African contributions to science and history have been reviled in the US Academy. And those who have insisted that African civilizations existed and that Africans have made philosophical contributions to the world have remain a marginalized minority in Western educational institutions. These are now dominated by neoliberal rationalities that have little space for research or teaching in philosophy, and indeed the humanities in general are under threat. I hardly need to say that there are very few women within the limited spaces afforded to African philosophy where in the world's universities, both on the continent and in the diaspora. The formation of this network might make it possible to do a survey to find out just how many women and how many feminists and how we are faring in departments of philosophy, because currently we don't have that information. However, as I began by saying, given that humanity began in Africa, it makes sense to locate the origins of philosophy on the same continent as Cheikh Anta Diop does. It is clear that by the time of the ancient Egyptians, the love of wisdom was already a feature of African civilization, discernible in the hieroglyphs and frescoes that adorn the ancient monuments and tombs. It is therefore my inclination to insist that philosophy, that love of wisdom and the ability to reflect on the world, originated with humanity on the African continent. Africa's philosophical heritage was rendered deniable only by 500 years of conquest, mass enslavement, and colonialism. The imperialists had to deem Africans incapable of higher thought, because to acknowledge otherwise would have exposed their behavior towards Black and brown peoples of the world for what they were, atrocities of men against men. This is not to say that women were not involved in imperialism. There is ample evidence that they became increasingly involved on both sides, both on the side of empire and in the resistance in the course of the 20th century. Early European travelers frequently portrayed Africans as beasts, and some even described Africans as monsters with tails. Tails or no tails, the African was said to exhibit only primitive modes of thought in which rhythm prevailed over reason. And in the age of reason, rational thought came to be seen as the prerogatives of the European mind. So in the works of the celebrated Western philosophers, Kant, Hegel, and Levi-Bruhl, for example, Africans are constructed again and again as culturally inept, primitive, and incapable of rational thought. The rise of racist scientific ideologies during the 18th and 19th centuries provided the Europeans with further justifications for denying the humanity of Africans. That is, they manufactured these justifications, suggesting that we were subhuman beings incapable of philosophy. This history of suppression and eradication has placed an enormous burden on contemporary African philosophers. African philosophers are faced with the challenges of restoring, recovering, and defining Africa's philosophical heritage long before we think about action in the future. Yet the urgency of our circumstances also makes it incumbent on us to produce philosophical writings that speak to the present and to the future of the world. Africa's anti-colonial thinkers have done much work to refute racist epistemologies, and the changes that have arisen with nationalism and flag independence and the disappointments of neocolonialism have nonetheless opened the way for African philosophy to come into its own as a vast field of critical study. These developments have also made it possible for African women to join the ranks of the world's recognized philosophers, given that we have been philosophizing through time. My concern here today is not limited strictly to the academic discipline of philosophy as already constituted, for reasons that should be clear. The discipline was constituted in the West in the context of a European age of empire and has been very slow to take African philosophy seriously. Furthermore, the field of African philosophy that emerged since independence has largely excluded women. So if we want to consider African philosophy and consider women in philosophy, we need a broader definition than that which prevails in the existing establishment of elite philosophy departments. And this has been true because departments of African philosophy have been the most exclusionary of all. This has been true in relation to the continent as well as across the scattered diasporas that initially produced Pan-African philosophy as the unifying political philosophy of African liberation. Passing through any of our educational systems today, one could be forgiven for having the impression that there weren't any African women philosophers. Few, if any, are included in the teaching curriculum prevailing in most universities. And we ourselves are far more likely to know the names of male philosophers, and in our case, African male philosophers. The names that most readily come to my mind, apart from Cheikh Anta Diop, are those of Paulhan Hutunji, the author of African Philosophy, Myth and Reality, or Kwame Nkrumah, the author of Conscientism, Valentin Mudimbe, The Invention of Africa, or Kwasi Wiredu, the author of Philosophy and African Culture, and so on. The list is long, but it is masculine. The diversity of their philosophical discourses shows that there isn't a single African philosophy, because it is clear that Africans are philosophically diverse, replete with debates, contradictions, and divergent positions that must all be aired and debated. None of these men agree with each other, and that is how it's supposed to be. It's healthy. Diversity characterizes Africa, whether we are addressing the indigenous legacies that reflect our numerous ethnicities, languages, and cultures, or the differing external influences that have intervened and violently recodified many of these in accordance with the epistemic violence of Western thinking on the colonized. I do not need to provide a comprehensive listing of African philosophers for us to see that despite their diversity, most of those we know to be philosophers are men, and all of their works deserve to be thoroughly engaged by women philosophers. We have work to do. The present-day circumstances of the continent and the diaspora demand a massive response from Africans, and we can ill afford to deprive ourselves of the talent residing among us, the 50% of African thinkers who are women. If we are to liberate ourselves from the negative heritage of the past, our responses to the prevailing conditions have to be historically astute They must be able to take account of our colonial histories of exploitation and oppression and their continuation under so many neocolonial regimes. The present order is one that has excluded much of African cultural and historical wealth from the sphere of philosophy, and the intellectual legacies of African civilization that predated colonialism have been disparaged, denied, and erased. For Africans, restoration, recuperation, and celebration have preceded the tasks of critically reflecting on and changing the world. On one hand, the omission of African women from the pantheon of African philosophers reflects a reality in which the prevailing gender marginalization in education still makes it very hard for women to pursue careers in such an elite field, one that has therefore remained profoundly dominated by men of all cloths and creeds. On the other hand, the ongoing marginalization of women also reflects the gross disregard for women's contributions to already existing African philosophies. It is to the credit of everyone here that African women are now claiming their space as philosophers and directing our energies to correcting and overcoming the baggage of the past. I was therefore delighted to learn that there is such a thing as the League of African Women Philosophers. Sorry about that. I was delighted to learn that there is such a thing as the League of African Philosophers, African Women Philosophers, and that this is a group of women who declare that they are philosophers and that African women contribute to the field of philosophy. After all, philosophy matters. Not just because philosophical assumptions undergird and inform all other academic disciplines, but because the bearing it has on how we make sense of the world we inhabit, a point I will come back to. The erasure and marginalization of African women's contributions to philosophy is one of the stated motivations for organizing a network. For this reason alone, I commend the founder of the League of Women Philosophers, Abosede Ipadiola, for her vision and for all the work that she and her colleagues have undertaken to bring this network into existence. I commend all of you who have signed up to become members. And as soon as I heard of it, I asked to be included and to become a member because I was so excited. I've learnt over the decades that organizing scholarly networks is a powerful, tested, and tried way of overcoming exclusion and marginalization experienced by women intellectuals. Networks build confidence, they build identity, they build community, and community is empowering. And given the atomization of many of us are working alone in isolation. We need networks in order to cultivate and incubate our ideas and intellect. Throughout my career, I've derived a great deal of inspiration from the networks of African scholars, African feminist scholars in particular, that have emerged over the last several decades. These networks have been behind a slew of African feminist research, curriculum development, writing and publication projects. The outputs of much of the work that we carried out under that network can be found in the open access digital journal Feminist Africa. Let me take the opportunity in passing to note that Feminist Africa has been in existence for more than 22 years, 23 years now. And up until today, it has yet to publish an issue on the subject of philosophy. This is surely overdue for a feminist African publication that has been around for this long. While I'm no longer an editor at Feminist Africa, I would still urge us to consider such an issue as a matter of urgency. It is something I dreamed of, but never actualized. Networking among ourselves offers us ways of developing mutual support system and sisterhood, and ways of strengthening the important work of exchanging, debating, and developing ideas and creating safe spaces for that purpose. I'm now going to move on to discuss briefly the possibilities that the existence of such a network heralds and some of the epistemological challenges that arise to confront us. pushing us to consider the basis on which we might operate an intellectual network of this kind. I wish to consider the project of African women's philosophy and its relation to the feminist philosophies that have developed out of women's struggles for recognition and redistribution in all spheres of knowledge. Who are Africa's women philosophers? Philosophy as a discipline, we have heard, is emerged as a bastion of masculine supremacy that is traced back to the earliest universities, which in the West, they say, were medieval monasteries that preceded other European universities and were situated in Germany. In the Western philosophical community, women were also excluded and marginalized, and this reality galvanized the emergence of feminist philosophy. Western feminist philosophers challenge the androcentrism that frames and permeates Western thought, and feminist philosophers in the West have therefore enunciated liberatory philosophical discourses that seek to advance the freedom of women from the oppressive sex and gender-based hegemonies that have come to prevail globally. Leading lights who are commonly listed among the contemporary feminist philosophers of the West are the women philosophers and feminist philosophers of the West, include the likes of Hannah Arendt, Simone de Beauvoir, Judith Butler, Nancy Fraser, Nancy Hartsock, Linda Martin Alcoff, Donna Haraway, Sandra Harding, Sayla Ben-Habib, Alison Jagger, Julia Kristeva, Helen Longino, and many other feminist contributors to philosophy. You will notice that none of those I have mentioned are African, but I want to note in passing that the Western Feminist Journal of Philosophy, Hypatia, is named after an African woman philosopher. Hypatia was an Egyptian Neoplatonist astronomer and mathematician who lived in Alexandria between 350 and 415 AD. And while I'm at it, I might also mention Fatima al-Fihri, the Tunisian philanthropist and philosopher who established one of the world's first universities in the ancient city of Fez. In fact, many people say that it is the oldest university in the world. These are just traces of a lineage of African women. Those who are listed as women philosophers in today's world are most exclusively European and Western descent women, with few exceptions. Most of their work, therefore, challenges the oppression and marginalization of women in the Western world, but it seldom addresses the histories of Western empire as such, and has little to say on any of the challenges facing the African continent. However, the listings of women philosophers that are generated when you search for them do include some leading anti-colonial feminist thinkers that we should take note of and whose work deserves our serious attention. Among these is Dorothy Roberts, philosopher of science at University of Penn State, University of Pennsylvania. And Sylvia Wynter, an Afro-Caribbean philosopher based at Stanford University. However, let me also pay tribute to the first woman philosopher I ever met, first Black woman philosopher I ever met, and she is Professor Angela Yvonne Davis from the University of California, Santa Cruz. I met her when she visited London during the 1980s as a guest of the then left-wing government. She completed her doctorate with Marxist philosopher Herbert Marcuse at UC San Diego and taught philosophy at UCLA before she achieved global fame. People will probably be familiar with the story. In the 1970s, she became the subject of a global campaign for freedom when the FBI declared her the most wanted woman in the USA on charges that were later shown to be completely spurious. Davis has since emerged as a major activist in the pursuit of liberation from all forms of oppression. Angela Yvonne Davis is undoubtedly the best known of the African-American women philosophers, and she is better known for her philosophically informed political practice, her leftist activism, than for her contributions to the more abstract discourses of academic philosophy. In other words, when we begin to look for women in philosophy, we also expand the definition to make it more inclusive so as not to exclude women who contribute valuably to discourses concerned with freedom and liberation. Let me also, following Dr. Ipadiola's remarks, by coincidence, we're mentioning the same African women philosophers. I want to pay tribute to the first African woman philosopher I ever met. She was Professor Sophie Oluwole, who taught at the University of Lagos and made significant contributions to Yoruba thought in her writings. Some credit her with founding the Yoruba School of Philosophy. I met Professor Sophie through another network. At the time, we had created a network for women's studies in Nigeria in the late 1990s with Professor Bolanle Awe, the historian. And Sophie Oluwale pursued the work of recovery in her request to unearth the philosophy of the ancient Yoruba civilization. Her work laid the foundations for a deep and historicized understanding of Yoruba philosophy. The second woman philosopher I met was my prematurely late friend and colleague, Aminata Diaw, the Senegalese philosopher who Professor Ipadiola has already mentioned. She was at Cheikh Anta Diop, where she was the only woman in the department when I knew her. And for a long time, she was the only feminist in a department that did not recognize feminism, let alone the existence of feminist philosophy. And there are several others we could name. Here are some examples. I think Ama Ata Aidu, our eminent novelist and thinker's work deserves proper philosophical attention. She has now passed away, but her body of work is there, and the literary philosophers have a job to do in terms of articulating and sharing and disseminating and discussing, engaging with her ideas. Bibi Bakare Yusuf is another philosopher I met through the through the network for women's studies in Nigeria. And she's famous not as a philosopher, but for founding a publishing house. So many women who are trained in philosophy move into other spheres, but I think that we should still be calling them into a network like this to contribute and to reactivate them as philosophers. And then, of course, most of us will know Nkiru Nzegu at State University of New York, born in 1954. She's an art historian and philosopher, and here's a copy of her book, Feminist Concepts in the African Philosophy of Culture. So I asked to be included in this group, and then, of course, we have our own. I don't think we should shy away from recognizing what we have among us, our own founder of the League, whose new book deserves commendations, Feminist African Philosophy, Women and the Politics of Difference. I don't want to embarrass you, Dr. Ipadiola, but this is such an exciting volume. I couldn't let you hide it from us. So in forming a community, instead of being scattered, we are now able to gather, assess, deliberate, and develop our agendas for philosophical work. And first among these, for me, is the political philosophical question of Africa's liberation and development. There can be no liberation of Africa without the liberation of African women. We all know this. But what does philosophical thinking have to offer to the cause of Africa's liberation and of African women's liberation in an era of continued neocolonialism and underdevelopment? To address the question of liberation requires a capacious approach because outside the Marxist tradition, most Western philosophy does not center questions of freedom and liberation in the way that Africans must for reasons of history. Yet the situation of the African world surely demands an approach that is informed by commitments to freedom and justice, and these are espoused by feminism. When we broaden our scope to include feminist philosophical thinkers, then it becomes clear that many African women are profoundly philosophical in our engagement with the world. Philosophical thinking has never been the exclusive preserve of typically male-dominated philosophy departments. But what all of us as professional intellectuals enjoy is the enormous privilege of being able to devote our time to philosophical reflection. And some of us are privileged enough to build careers dedicated to intellectual labor of this kind. With such privilege comes a huge burden of responsibility, but this is not one that we carry alone, divorced from other social forces and movements pursuing liberation. As I noted, philosophy predated the establishment of all academic disciplines, but they are all rooted in philosophical premises. So while I'm not a philosopher in the formal sense of having been trained as one, I have found it empowering and helpful to read and refer to philosophers throughout my work. So in developing anti-colonial critiques of psychology, it was very important for me to read the Western philosophers in my formative years. And I continue to find it helpful to consider the work of feminist philosophies in developing my perspectives and honing arguments on the ethical and methodological challenges of studying Africa. Coming back to the League, one short answer to the question, where and who are African women's philosophers, is this: we are here. Our existence is confirmed and consolidated by the very fact of a League of Women Philosophers. It is also confirmed by all the philosophical works that we are producing. For a starting point, we can begin, therefore, by defining African women's philosophy as that body of philosophical works produced by African women, just as African philosophy has been defined as the corpus of philosophical writings produced by African philosophers. But how do we, members of this league, want to define philosophy for ourselves? What is our vision and mission? And how should we engage with contemporary African philosophy and feminist philosophy? At the very least, we must engage with both fields as we develop our own reflection. The League sets out a mission that centers on mutual support and engagement. This is well and good, but do we collectively share any particular understanding of the world that might guide our outward and forward-facing mission? The League has a powerful starting point in its declared mission. It's based on a strong confidence in the transforming potential of philosophy. We picture a society in which philosophical investigation is useful for individuals and communities and is not restricted to the ivory towers of the academia. We hope to cultivate critical thinking skills and increased levels of understanding and constructive action through the application of philosophy. This is a powerful starting point, and the mission continues to state its relevance to change in the real world. So this is not an ivory tower association. It is an association which is determined to convene and curate and bring philosophical discourse to bear on the challenges that face the African world. We do not, therefore, wish to commit ourselves to philosophy for philosophy's sake. Instead, we wish to have relevance and influence on the worlds we inhabit. The point is not for us to merely think about the world, as many great male philosophers have done, or simply to add women to this pantheon. Our goal must be to change the world. It seems to me to be morally incumbent on us to respond to the collective reality of African people and African women in particular. What are the material and existential conditions that characterize the realities lived by African women in the world today? African women, men, and gender non-conforming communities all inhabit the patriarchal conditions of late capitalist globalization, and these are having particularly deleterious effects on neocolonial Africa. Long histories of colonialism and neocolonial underdevelopment have ensured that Africa remains the most precariously situated continent, bedeviled with coups, conflicts, economic shocks, extractivism, land seizures, and some of the worst effects of climate change. This overall situation is striated by intersecting global and local cultural, class, gender, and racial divisions in such a way that African women are even more negatively impacted than men, even as the situation of African men leaves much to be desired. It is the desperation for the possibility of decent lives that leads thousands of Africans to being trafficked in the hope of reaching that damned Europe where they are never done talking of man. The floor of the Mediterranean and that small channel of water that separates Britain from France have become graveyards for drowned Africans in the way that the Atlantic once was. How do we respond to the realities we inhabit, where Africa occupies such a difficult place in the history of the world? We need philosophers of liberation. Feminist philosophers are philosophers who embrace the visions and politics of women's liberation. And African feminist philosophers conceptualize African liberation as including the liberation of women from indigenous and inherited manifestations of patriarchy. As I have defined it elsewhere, feminism is the theory, philosophy, and politics and practices of the movement for women's liberation. It has numerous manifestations all over the world, but importantly, it offers us tools, intellectual tools and strategies for demystifying and working to change the myriad historical and material realities that oppress and exploit African women. I prefer to refer to feminism in Africa or African feminisms in the plural rather than to use the singular term African feminism, because just as there is no single African philosophy, there can be no single African feminist philosophy, because the theories and practices of the struggles for women's liberation vary according to context. Feminist thought and movements arise out of the rich flux of conditions in Africa as elsewhere. As Angela Davis states it, when we identify into feminism, we mean new epistemologies, new ways of producing knowledge and transforming social relations. As scholars and activists, we realize that the categories always fall short of the social realities they attempt to represent, and social realities always exceed the categories that attempt to contain them. That is why we keep changing our vocabularies. In other words, feminism, whenever it is put into practice, is not an abstract philosophical paradigm that just happens to be concerned with women. It is, in fact, a powerful and transformative methodology that constantly renews itself as it proceeds. So feminist methodologies, if I may quote Davis once more, both for research and organizing, impel us to explore connections that are not always apparent. They drive us to inhabit contradictions and discover what is productive in these contradictions and methods of action and thought. They urge us to think things together that appear to be entirely separate and to disaggregate things that appear to belong naturally together. Finally, I'll say that in the 21st century, Black and anti-colonial feminisms have intervened in ways that develop contemporary Western feminist discourse beyond its early ethnocentric universalism by insisting on the simultaneity of gender with coloniality, as well as with race, class, and other dimensions of oppression. Look, this is not something that is new to African women, because in the anti-colonial liberation movements, women also came up with the idea of interconnected oppressions. As early as the 1970s, women in Guinea-Bissau were describing their struggle as being against double oppressions arising from colonialism on the one hand and from indigenous patriarchal traditions on the other. The emancipation of women was an intrinsic aspect of all the African revolutionary anti-colonial movements of the 60s and 70s, and this proud legacy continues to undergird Africa's feminist movements today. This trajectory is affirmed in the Charter for African Feminist Principles, the platform document of the African Feminist Forum, which we developed in 2006. This states, by naming ourselves as feminists, we politicize the struggle for women's rights, we question the legitimacy of the structures that keep women subjugated, and we develop tools for transformatory analysis and action. We have multiple and varied identities as African feminists. Our feminist identity is not qualified with ifs, buts, or howevers. We are feminists, full stop. This is an interesting document that we might wish to consult as we think about developing an agenda for African feminist philosophy. The African Feminist Forum has become an important space for the articulation and propagation of continental feminism since 2006. And since that time, there have been multiple regional and national convenings. And currently, a 20th anniversary forum is being planned in consultation with the African Women's Development Foundation. That is not a scholarly network, it is a women's movement network, but it nonetheless deserves our attention and engagement, as do the other feminist scholarly networks that exist or that are being formed out there. In other words, I'm suggesting that the League of African Women Philosophers itself network with other feminist scholarly networks networks to strengthen its hand. The African Feminist Charter diagnoses the problems facing women in terms of it states, patriarchal ideology enables and legitimizes the structuring of every aspect of our lives by establishing the framework within which society defines and views men and women and constructs male supremacy. Our ideological task as feminists is to understand this, and our political task is to end it. These precedents lead me to conclude that for African women philosophers to be relevant, we must not just be philosophers who are women. We must do more than recover the past contributions of women to African philosophical thought. We must use our imaginations and all our talents, of which we are not short, to address the future. We must pursue and develop African feminist philosophy, or rather philosophies, plural, that can guide us towards a more comprehensive liberation for all. We have the history, we have the wisdom, we have the heritage. Let us carry it forward. I look forward to the deliberations of this historic gathering, as these will surely contribute to carrying our thinking on African liberation forward. Thank you very much for your attention.